Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! Frederick stumbled out of his front door, his heart pounding with panic. His beloved golden retriever, Rusty, had somehow slipped out of the backyard while Frederick was distracted getting ready for a costume party. Now, Rusty was nowhere to be found. "Rusty! Here, boy!" Frederick called out desperately, his voice cracking with worry. He scanned up and down the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of Rusty's wagging tail or hear the jingle of his collar. But the neighborhood was quiet, with only the rustling of leaves in the breeze answering his calls. Frederick's mind raced as he considered where Rusty could have gone. The dog park a few blocks away? The wooded area behind the elementary school? Or worse, had he wandered onto one of the busier roads nearby? A car door slammed somewhere down the street, snapping Frederick out of his spiraling thoughts. He needed to act fast if he was going to find Rusty before dark. Without a second thought, he dashed back inside to grab his keys and wallet. As he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror, Frederick froze for a split second. In his panic over Rusty, he'd completely forgotten he was still wearing the ridiculous costume from the party he'd been preparing for. The flouncy pink dress with its layers of tulle and sparkly sequins looked absurd on his tall, lanky frame. A curly blonde wig sat slightly askew on his head, and smudges of glittery eyeshadow and bright red lipstick were smeared across his face. Frederick hesitated for just a moment, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. But the image of Rusty, lost and alone, pushed all other concerns from his mind. There was no time to change. Finding his beloved dog was all that mattered now. Keys in hand, Frederick rushed out to his beat-up Corolla and peeled out of the driveway. He drove through the neighborhood with windows down, calling Rusty's name and scanning frantically for any sign of his furry friend. After circling several blocks with no luck, Frederick's stomach sank as he realized Rusty must have wandered further than he'd feared. With shaking hands, Frederick pulled out his phone and searched for the nearest animal shelter. The Oakdale Animal Rescue Center was only a 10-minute drive away. Maybe someone had found Rusty and brought him there. It was worth a shot. As he navigated the busy streets toward the shelter, Frederick tried to calm his racing thoughts. Rusty had to be okay. He just had to be. Frederick couldn't bear the thought of losing his loyal companion of the past 8 years. Rusty had been there through thick and thin, comforting Frederick after bad breakups, motivating him on early morning runs, curling up next to him during late nights working from home. The big goofball was more than just a pet. He was family. Frederick pulled into the animal shelter parking lot and cut the engine. As he reached for the door handle, he caught sight of his garish costume once again in the rearview mirror. Heat rose to his cheeks as he imagined the stares and snickers he was about to endure. But there was no time to be self-conscious now. Finding Rusty was all that mattered. Taking a deep breath, Frederick stepped out of the car and strode toward the shelter entrance, his sparkly pink tulle dress swishing around his knees. He kept his eyes focused straight ahead, trying to ignore the curious glances from other visitors in the parking lot. The automatic doors slid open with a whoosh, and Frederick found himself in a brightly lit lobby. The cacophony of barking dogs and meowing cats filled the air. A young woman with curly red hair sat behind the front desk, tapping away at a computer. She looked up as Frederick approached, her eyebrows raising slightly at his unusual appearance. "Can I help you?" she asked, managing to keep her tone professional despite her obvious surprise. Frederick cleared his throat, willing his voice not to crack. "Yes, I'm looking for my dog. He's a golden retriever named Rusty. He got out of my yard about an hour ago, and I can't find him anywhere. I was hoping someone might have brought him here." The receptionist's face softened with understanding. "I'm so sorry to hear that. Let me check our intake logs for the past couple hours." She turned back to her computer and began typing rapidly. As Frederick waited anxiously, he became acutely aware of the stares from other people in the lobby. An elderly couple waiting on a bench openly gawked at him. A little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and loudly whispered, "Mommy, why is that man wearing a dress?" Frederick felt his face burning as he shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. He silently cursed himself for not taking 2 minutes to change clothes before racing out of the house. Now, on top of worrying about Rusty, he had to deal with the humiliation of being a public spectacle. After what felt like an eternity, the receptionist looked up from her computer with an apologetic smile. "I'm afraid we don't have any golden retrievers that have been brought in today, but I can take down your information and Rusty's description. We'll be sure to contact you right away if he's brought in." Frederick's shoulders slumped in disappointment. "Okay, thank you," he said quietly. He described Rusty in detail, his reddish-gold coat, the white patch on his chest, his friendly demeanor, and provided his contact information. As the receptionist jotted everything down, a door behind the desk opened and a tall woman in scrubs emerged. She had an aura of quiet authority that marked her as someone in charge. "Everything all right out here, Jen?" the woman asked, glancing between the receptionist and Frederick. "Yes, Dr. Martinez," the receptionist replied. "I'm just taking down information about a lost dog." Dr. Martinez turned her piercing gaze to Frederick, taking in his unusual attire. But instead of the judgment or amusement he expected to see, her eyes lit up with admiration. "I have to say, that is a stunning dress," Dr. Martinez remarked. "The color is absolutely perfect on you, and I love how you've done your makeup. The glittery eyeshadow really makes your eyes pop." Frederick blinked in surprise, completely thrown off guard by the unexpected compliment. "Oh, thank you," he stammered. "It's just a silly costume for a party." Dr. Martinez waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense. You look fabulous. I only wish I could pull off an outfit like that with such confidence." A warmth bloomed in Frederick's chest, chasing away some of the anxiety and embarrassment he'd been feeling. He found himself standing a little straighter, smoothing down the sparkly fabric of the dress. "That's very kind of you to say," Frederick replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The receptionist, Jen, nodded in agreement. "The doctor's right. Pink is definitely your color. And those heels! I'm impressed you can walk in those. I'd be falling all over myself." Frederick glanced down at the strappy pink heels he'd forgotten he was wearing. They weren't the most practical footwear for searching for a lost dog, but he had to admit they did make his legs look great. "Well, I've had some practice," Frederick found himself saying with a chuckle. "My sister made me wear heels for her wedding last year. Said she didn't want me towering over her in the photos." Dr. Martinez laughed. "Smart woman, your sister. Though I bet you still looked stunning next to her in the wedding pics." For a moment, Frederick almost forgot about the stress and worry of losing Rusty. There was something oddly freeing about standing here in this outrageous outfit, chatting and laughing with these two kind women who seemed to see past the surface to the person underneath. But reality came crashing back as another family entered the shelter, their eyes widening at the sight of Frederick in his glittery pink ensemble. He felt his cheeks flush once again as he remembered the reason he was here in the first place. "Well, I should probably get going," Frederick said, fidgeting with the tulle of his skirt. "Need to keep looking for Rusty. Thank you both for your help. and the kind words." Dr. Martinez's expression grew serious once more. "Of course. I truly hope you find your dog soon. Please don't hesitate to call us if you need anything else. And remember to check back regularly. Sometimes it takes a day or two for lost pets to be brought in." Frederick nodded gratefully and turned to leave. As he pushed open the shelter doors, he heard Dr. Martinez call out behind him. "And honey, don't let anyone make you feel bad about how you look. You keep rocking that dress." A warmth spread through Frederick's chest as he stepped out into the fading afternoon light. Despite the stress of losing Rusty and the initial mortification of being seen in this ridiculous costume, he felt a strange sense of lightness. The genuine compliments and easy acceptance from the shelter staff had touched something deep inside him, a part of himself he'd always kept hidden and suppressed. As Frederick climbed back into his car, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts and emotions. On one hand, finding Rusty was still his top priority, but he couldn't shake the lingering sensations of wearing the dress, the swish of fabric against his legs, the sparkle of sequins catching the light. For the first time, he allowed himself to really consider how it made him feel. There was a freedom in it, he realized, a chance to express a softer, more graceful side of himself that he usually kept buried beneath a facade of traditional masculinity. The way Dr. Martinez and Jen had responded to him, with genuine admiration rather than judgment or ridicule, made him wonder if perhaps there was nothing shameful about embracing this part of himself after all. Frederick shook his head, trying to focus on the task at hand. He had a lost dog to find. He could sort out these unexpected feelings about gender expression later, but as he pulled out of the parking lot to continue his search, he found himself driving a little slower than before, savoring the swish of tulle against the car seat. The next few hours passed in a blur as Frederick combed the neighborhood, calling Rusty's name until his voice grew hoarse. He checked all of Rusty's favorite spots: the dog park, the wooded trail behind the elementary school, even the alley behind the deli where the owner sometimes slipped Rusty scraps of turkey. But there was no sign of his beloved pet anywhere. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the suburban streets, Frederick felt despair settling in his chest like a lead weight. What if something terrible had happened to Rusty? What if he never saw his furry best friend again? Exhausted and disheartened, Frederick finally pointed his car back toward home. He'd have to regroup, maybe print some lost dog flyers to post around the neighborhood. And he should probably change out of this ridiculous costume before... The screech of tires cut through Frederick's spiraling thoughts. He slammed on the brakes, heart pounding as he registered what he'd almost hit. A familiar golden shape darting across the road just yards ahead of his car. "Rusty!" Frederick cried out, throwing the car into park and leaping out without a second thought. "Rusty! Come here, boy!" The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his owner's voice. Rusty turned and bounded toward Frederick, tail wagging furiously. Frederick dropped to his knees, not caring about the rough asphalt scraping against his bare legs, and threw his arms around the dog's neck. "Oh, thank God," Frederick murmured, burying his face in Rusty's soft fur. "I was so worried about you, you big dope. Don't you ever run off like that again." Rusty responded by showering Frederick's face with eager doggy kisses, his whole body wiggling with joy at being reunited with his person. Frederick laughed, wiping away tears of relief that had started to fall. It wasn't until he heard a car horn honk behind him that Frederick remembered he was kneeling in the middle of the street, still wearing a glittery pink party dress and smeared makeup. He scrambled to his feet, face flushing as he waved apologetically to the line of cars that had formed. "Come on, Rusty," Frederick said, guiding the dog toward the sidewalk. "Let's get you home before I cause a traffic jam and make an even bigger spectacle of myself." As they walked the few blocks back to Frederick's house, he found himself acutely aware of the stares and double takes from passers-by. But the joy and relief of finding Rusty overshadowed any lingering embarrassment. Frederick held his head high, pink tulle swishing around his knees with each step. When they reached home, Frederick immediately filled Rusty's water bowl and gave him a hefty portion of kibble. As the dog happily munched away, Frederick caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror once again. His wig was askew, makeup smeared, and the once pristine dress was now wrinkled and stained with dirt and dog fur. But beneath the disheveled exterior, Frederick saw something different in his reflection, a spark of confidence and self-assurance that hadn't been there before. The events of the afternoon had forced Frederick to confront a part of himself he'd long kept hidden. The unexpected compliments and easy acceptance from the shelter staff had touched something deep inside him. For the first time, he allowed himself to really consider how wearing traditionally feminine clothing made him feel. There was a freedom in it, he realized, a chance to express a softer, more graceful side of himself that he usually kept buried beneath a facade of traditional masculinity. The way Dr. Martinez and Jen had responded to him, with genuine admiration rather than judgment or ridicule, made him wonder if perhaps there was nothing shameful about embracing this part of himself after all. Frederick ran his hands over the sparkly fabric of the dress, remembering the way it had swished and swirled around his legs as he searched for Rusty. He thought about how the heels had made him feel tall and elegant, how the makeup had accentuated his features in a way that felt both foreign and thrilling. With trembling fingers, Frederick reached up and carefully removed the blonde wig, setting it aside on the hallway table. He stared at his reflection, taking in the contrast between his short brown hair and the glittery pink dress. Instead of looking ridiculous or comical, he was struck by how the outfit seemed to highlight a different facet of his personality, one that felt authentic and true, even if it didn't align with society's expectations of how a man should look or act. A soft whine from Rusty broke Frederick out of his reverie. The dog had finished his dinner and was now looking up at his owner expectantly, tail wagging.
"What do you think, boy?"
Frederick asked softly, smoothing down the front of the dress.
"Is this crazy? Am I crazy for even considering?"
He trailed off, unable to fully articulate the thoughts and feelings swirling through his mind. Rusty cocked his head to the side, looking at Frederick with those soulful brown eyes that always seemed to see right through to his heart. Then the dog padded over and gently rested his head against Frederick's leg, offering wordless comfort and acceptance. Frederick smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Rusty's ears. "You're right," he murmured. "It doesn't really matter what anyone else thinks, does it? As long as I'm being true to myself." With a deep breath, Frederick straightened up and squared his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. This experience had opened his eyes to new possibilities, new ways of expressing himself that he'd never allowed himself to explore before, and he wasn't going to let fear or societal expectations hold him back any longer. "Come on, Rusty," Frederick said, a note of determination in his voice. "Let's go for a walk. I think I need some fresh air to clear my head and figure out where to go from here." As they stepped out into the cool evening air, Frederick held his head high, no longer concerned about the curious glances from neighbors. He had a lot of soul-searching ahead of him, a lot of questions to grapple with about identity and self-expression. But for now, he was content to simply enjoy the swish of fabric against his legs, the click of heels on the sidewalk, and the comforting presence of his loyal companion by his side. The sun had nearly set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink that seemed to mirror the sparkly dress Frederick wore. As they walked down the familiar streets of their neighborhood, Frederick found his mind drifting back to earlier moments in his life, times when he'd felt a pull toward more feminine expression, but had quickly squashed those impulses out of fear and shame. He remembered being 5 years old, sneaking into his mother's closet to try on her silky scarves and shimmery costume jewelry, the way his heart had raced with excitement as he draped himself in color and sparkle, twirling in front of the mirror. And then the crushing shame when his father had caught him, sternly lecturing about how little boys don't play dress-up. There was the time in middle school when he'd been cast as the lead in the spring musical. The thrill of stepping onto stage in full costume and makeup, feeling transformed and alive in a way he'd never experienced before. But then the taunts from his classmates, the whispered slurs in the hallways, until he'd begged his parents to let him quit the show. Even in college, when he'd felt freer to experiment with his identity, Frederick had always held back from fully embracing his interest in feminine clothing and expression. He'd stick to acceptable forms of androgyny, painting his nails black or wearing the occasional flowy shirt. But anything more overt felt too risky, too likely to invite ridicule or rejection. Now, walking down the street in a full sequined gown and heels, Frederick marveled at how liberating it felt to simply be, to move through the world adorned in a way that resonated with some deep, authentic part of himself. Societal expectations be damned. Rusty trotted happily beside him, occasionally glancing up as if to check that his human was okay. Frederick smiled down at the dog, grateful for his unwavering companionship and acceptance. As they rounded a corner, Frederick spotted a group of teenage boys hanging out in front of the convenience store up ahead. His steps faltered for a moment as old anxieties bubbled up, but then he took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and kept walking. He refused to let fear dictate his choices any longer. To Frederick's surprise, the boys barely gave him a second glance as he passed. One of them even called out, "Sick dress, dude!" with what sounded like genuine appreciation. Frederick felt a warmth bloom in his chest as he realized that perhaps the world had changed more than he'd realized in recent years. Or maybe he'd just been projecting his own insecurities onto others all this time. They circled the block, the repetitive motion of walking helping to calm Frederick's racing thoughts. By the time they turned back onto their own street, he felt a sense of clarity starting to emerge. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew he wanted to keep exploring this part of himself, to see where this newfound acceptance of his more feminine side might lead. As they approached their house, Frederick spotted his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen, watering her prized rose bushes. The elderly woman had always been kind to Frederick, often bringing over homemade dumplings or offering to watch Rusty when Frederick traveled for work. But she was also quite traditional, and Frederick felt a flutter of nervousness as her gaze fell on him. To his amazement, Mrs. Chen's face lit up with a warm smile. "Frederick, darling, don't you look absolutely lovely this evening? That color is divine on you." Frederick felt his cheeks flush with pleasure at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. That's very kind of you to say." The older woman set down her watering can and approached the fence separating their yards. You know, you remind me so much of my dear friend Liang from back home in Taiwan. He always said life was too short not to express yourself fully. Started wearing the most gorgeous cheongsams in his 60s and never looked back. She chuckled fondly at the memory. Really? Frederick asked, intrigued. And people were accepting of that. Mrs. Chen waved her hand dismissively. Oh, there were always some small-minded folks who didn't understand. But Liang didn't let that stop him from living authentically. He said the joy of being true to himself far outweighed any negativity from others. Frederick nodded slowly, turning Mrs. Chen's words over in his mind. That's really inspiring, actually. Thank you for sharing that with me. Anytime, dear, Mrs. Chen replied with a wink. Now, you must come over for tea soon and tell me all about where you got that fabulous dress. I think I need something sparkly for my next mahjong night. As Mrs. Chen returned to her gardening, Frederick felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The casual acceptance from his neighbor, coupled with her story about Liang, helped solidify the decision that had been forming in Frederick's mind throughout their walk. He was going to keep exploring this newfound interest in feminine expression, not just as a one-time costume, but as a genuine form of self-expression. He didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, whether it meant incorporating more traditionally feminine elements into his everyday wardrobe, or if he'd want to fully present as female sometimes. But he was committed to the journey of self-discovery, wherever it might lead. As Frederick unlocked the front door, Rusty bounding inside ahead of him, he felt a surge of excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. There would undoubtedly be challenges and difficult conversations as he navigated this new territory. But for the first time in his life, Frederick felt truly aligned with himself. Sparkly dress, smeared makeup, and all. He gave Rusty a final pat before heading to the bathroom to clean up. As he carefully removed the remains of his costume party makeup, Frederick studied his reflection in the mirror. The person staring back at him looked somehow both familiar and brand new, like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, spreading its wings for the first time.
Thanks for watching, my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!